Slavery's long-lasting effects on Latin America's development. Slavery is no secret to not only the history of Latin America, but around the world. This topic grabbed my attention because slaves went through so much that it's simply impossible for me not to educate myself of the things they did to shape the world, in this specific case, Latin America. As I learned more about the impact and the contributions slaves had, it gave me a better understanding of why the world is the way it is, and you can really see the difference their contributions made on us as a society and world. Today we will talk about the impact slavery had and how it shaped the Latin America we know today. So who will we be talking about today? Slaves and activists. What? The impact and legacy left in Latin America. Where? Latin America. And when? The early 1400s through mid-1900s. Although slaves at first weren't transported directly from Africa to Latin America, but via the transatlantic slave trade for centuries, things started to shift and slaves started to see themselves enter directly from Africa. Slavery in Latin America left its genetic contributions, left a cultural influence that we still see today, and was the backbone of many armies led by conquistadores. The legacy and impact that slavery left in Latin America can be seen in many ways, and we will explore some here. In order to understand the impact slavery had on Latin America, we first must understand how they got to Latin America. Although it was understood that slaves had already existed in parts of Latin America via the transatlantic slave trade, according to the Glider Landrum Institute of American History, after exploring the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, the Portuguese and Spaniards discovered Africans that were willing to trade not only goods, but also slaves. This was important because although they were mainly used for labor across the land which they resided in, the Spanish found more ways to use slaves, and this time it would be for matters related to war. Juan Garrido was an example of this. He originally was a slave like the rest until participating in conquests of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and most famously known, Mexico. We mention this because Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador, needed all the help he can rally in order to take down the Aztec Empire. So why is this all important? Well, it had not been for the help of slaves and the Aztec enemies, Hernán Cortés perhaps doesn't defeat the Aztec Empire, and things like the Spanish language doesn't get introduced to Mexico, or diseases like smallpox doesn't spread the land of the New World, killing 40 to 50 million people, while in Mexico the population was decimated by the war and the spread of disease. In what was a wait of 3 centuries, Mexico had enough and won over independence on September 16, 1810. The arrival of slaves in Latin America was a defining moment in certain nations in terms of their population's physical characteristics. Being that these slaves were African-born in descent, the more slaves that did come meant that more likely the African race would take over as primary race. In a data reference sheet that the book Slavery and Beyond provides, we can see the specific percentages in which these Latin American countries were made up of and how they relate to current times. We can see that the countries like Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Dominica, Haiti, along with a bunch of others, had a race and ethnic percentage more than 80%. This dates back to even before the contact with the New World in 1492. With a 15-to-1 African to European ratio during these times, it was quite evident that these ratios would have an impact on future generations to come. Last but not least, we take a look at the cultural impact that slavery in Latin America left. A great example of this would be none other than Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican activist that led a religious and cultural movement, leaving an everlasting impression across Latin America. The Rastafarian history can be described as a religion and political movement that believed they were being tested by God through slavery and economic injustice. Fast forward to the 1930s, this is where Garvey enters the scene. His intent behind his movement was to unify blacks with their land of origin, in this case being the Jamaicans and their country. This movement finally took effect when, in 1935, Leonard P. Howell established the first branch of Rastafari in Jamaica. He reiterated the beliefs that behind this movement, saying all blacks would gain the superiority over whites that had always been intended for them. Now, how does this slavery impact and leave a legacy in Latin America in this case? Well, because of the oppression and the bad treatment slaves encountered, this led to a religious and cultural movement not only in Jamaica, but Rastafarian was also adopted in a country like Brazil, and more connections were made with other cultures that were in other countries through slaves that were transported there.